Aloha, I'm Malia Zimmerman, and this is News Behind the News. Today I have a very special guest who is a former congressman, and he's going to give us the scoop on whether or not he's going to run, I'm hoping, for Senate or Congress, and also what he thinks about upcoming elections and politics in Washington, D.C. and Hawaii. I want to welcome Charles Djou.
Thank you, Malia.
It's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, glad to be back.
I got to visit you in Washington when you were in Congress and interview you there with a live feed.
Yes, and I enjoyed it. Thank you for visiting me in the nation's capital.
Sure. So tell me about yourself. What have you been up to since you got out of politics a little while ago?
Well, the biggest thing for me and the thing that gives me the greatest amount of joy is I'm back to being a normal dad. 2010 was very hectic for myself and my family, flying back and forth between Washington and Honolulu. Now, one of the nice things is that I can actually see my children. So that's
you have
the
three
biggest
children?
thing. Yes, I do. So I am very busy. Or more importantly, my wife is very busy.
Yes, I know. And I know she's a very good professional woman too. So you guys have a good balancing.
Thank you.
What about in terms of Washington right now? Do you have? There's a lot of people retiring. Senator Kaka's retiring. There's going to be a big mix-up probably in the Senate and the House. What do you think about Hawaii in terms of the election coming up? We have Ed Case already jumping in the race. Mazie Hirono.
Malia, I think the biggest thing that the people of Hawaii need to understand is that, unfortunately, we don't have a voice in Washington, D.C. We don't have a seat at the table. The reason for that is in the U.S. House of Representatives, it's now controlled by the Republicans. And with an all 100% Democrat delegation, we have no one talking to the new Republican majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. My experience when I was in Washington, D.C. as a congressman, I frequently marveled that the most effective state delegations weren't the ones of all one party or another. It was ones composed of members of both political parties. Because while the parties may disagree and fight very, very bitterly over the big issues like healthcare or Afghanistan or taxes, when it comes to a state-specific issue, I was often very surprised to see the most effective state delegations were the ones that had both Republicans and Democrats that go fight for just their state on their state's issues. Republicans go to the Republican caucus and fight for their state with the Republicans. Democrats go to the Democratic caucus and fight for the state amongst the Democrats. And as a great example of this is, we just recently saw that the USS Bowfin National Submarine Museum in Pearl Harbor is exempting in funding for their museum. And we had nobody fighting for the Bowfin. Why? Because nobody is communicating how important this is for our community in Washington, D.C. I am very disappointed that I believe that our delegation, aside from Senator Inouye, has been, generally speaking, very quiet and remarkably ineffective. And I think we need to change that.
Okay, so you were in Washington, and what do you think when you were there what did you accomplish? Yeah. I know you talked about the Jones Act.
Yes, I think there's a lot of things that I'm very, very proud of and can point to here. You're right, I did talk about the Jones Act, raised that as a national issue in front of the press, got some good editorials in national publications, including, for example, the Washington Post. But also, I think I highlighted issues that concerned Hawaii, such as the Free Trade Act between the United States and South Korea. I was very pleased that after I got there, I made a big push for that. The President Obama, also agreed that this is something that's needed. It's something that will directly assist all of us here in Hawaii in increasing Hawaii as a tourist destination for the rising middle class in South Korea. I was very happy that I was able to directly question Federal Reserve Chairman Benjamin Bernanke and clearly articulate and explain to the American people the gigantic dangers of this enormous budget deficit and ballooning national debt. And we've got to absolutely get it under control. But I think for me, the most exciting aspect of it all was to be an effective voice for the people of Hawaii, to provide that bipartisan representation for Hawaii that I think has been so long missing in our congressional delegation.
When you questioned Ben Bernanke, I remember that there was a lot of national media coverage because you were right there in his face, kind of trying to pin him down. Talk a little bit about that.
That was an interesting experience. I was a member when I was in Congress. I served on two committees, the Armed Services and the Budget Committee. And what happened, there was a Budget Committee hearing. Anybody, if you've ever watched Chairman Bernanke respond to questioning, he is a remarkably circumspect man. He doesn't exactly answer the questions straight. And maybe perhaps for me, just being the new guy there, I just kept on hammering away at the Fed chairman saying, well, what exactly do you mean by deficits being unsustainable? And what is it exactly do you mean? But when you say we've got to get our spending under control, and I was able to pin him down, and it was the first time he had made the statement clearly that, you know, when we were running, we still unfortunately are running, budget deficits in the neighborhood of $1.5 trillion. That's bad. All economists agree it's bad. There's a little bit of disagreement as what finally would constitute an okay number, an acceptable number for the U.S. economy. And I was able to pin down Ben Bernanke, and he said that he felt that if we got the budget deficit down to around $250, $300 billion, while not good, that is sustainable. I mean, he felt the United States economy is large enough, robust enough, vibrant enough, we probably can sustain and withstand a $200, $250, $300 billion budget deficit. But there's clear universal agreement that at $1.5 trillion, there is no way we can sustain this budget deficit. And over the long term, it is going to erode the future of the United States of America and our American economy.
No question about that.
Yeah.
And you were also on the armed services. So what were the big issues for that, and how did that relate to Hawaii?
Well, of course, you know, after tourism, defense is the second largest sector of Hawaii's economy. So, of course, the defense and the defense budget is very important to all of us in the islands. It also has a little bit of personal interest in me in that I am an Army reservist, have been and still am in the United States Army Reserve. While I was on the Armed Services Committee, there's a number of things that came up. Of course, the war in Afghanistan has been, continues to be amongst the more controversial aspects of it. While I think there's, of course, room for improvement as a general statement, I support President Obama's position that we have got to be there and we've got to prevail and we must defeat the Taliban. And a rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan is bad for our nation. That's a position to which I disagreed with Congresswoman Hirono, and she supported an immediate withdrawal from Afghanistan.
So how important was it that we found Osama bin Laden? And
I think it's great for the United States. I mean, this is clearly this is a good thing. It's a good development for the United States. It is a good development for freedom and liberty. I think it is not the end by any means. We have not defeated al-Qaeda. We have not vanquished the Taliban. But hopefully, it is the beginning of the end. I think in the near term, it's going to present some struggles for the United States and our allies in Afghanistan, as I believe the Taliban and al-Qaeda will lash out against the U.S. and our allies. But over the long term, this is an exceptionally positive development.
So besides the budget and the war on terror, what are the biggest issues in Washington right now that you think need to be tackled?
Yeah. Well, hands down. I mean, and I don't mean to beat this again and again, but it has got to be with our spending. And we have got to get our fiscal house in order, and we've got to turn around this economy. And the way we do that is that we need a heck of a lot more private sector jobs, not more government sector programs. And I think that is at its core the difference that we have in the debate we're having right now in Washington, D.C. Do you believe that the way to get the deficit under control, the way to fix our nation's economy, is it going to be through more and more government programs? Or do you believe, as I believe here, that's going to be with entrepreneurs, with small business owners, and more private sector jobs? That at its core is its major disagreement I think we have right now. But if I could also just elaborate a little bit more, Malia, perhaps. Sure. I think over the long term, for Hawaii, is we've got to realize here that the world is rapidly changing. The way politics works is rapidly changing. There once was a time in the 20th century that the path to power was building lots and lots of seniority, sitting in a seat, being very quiet, and slowly amassing seniority. And that's how you get power in Washington, D.C. and can help your constituents. In the 21st century, with the advent of the internet, with social media, with a 24/7 news cycle, although seniority isn't unimportant, it has become more important to be outspoken, to get out there and to be a very zealous advocate for your constituents, to get in front of those national news publications and explain to the nation why your community's concerns are the most important. And I think a perfect illustration of that, first on the Republican side, I think, for example, would be Kevin McCarthy. He's now the majority whip in the U.S. House. In a span of 4 years, he went from an unknown California state representative to now the Republican majority whip in the House. That's an unprecedented rise.
Except for Barack Obama.
Exactly. I'd say the only one that's even better than that, of course, or more profound is Barack Obama.
Right.
And he went from an unknown state senator in Illinois to the presidency of the United States in 4 years.
Right.
And what I think this shows here is that the old way of doing things, about being very quiet, sitting behind in the backgrounds, being very partisan, loyal to your particular caucus, that may have been the way things worked in Washington, D.C. in the 20th century. but they're not the way they work now in the 21st century. And we've got to change that. And that's why it's so important we get new style of representation for Hawaii and Washington, D.C.
Well, one of the things I remember was a rating that came out right after, it was earlier this year, I believe, that said you're the most moderate, one of two most moderate Republicans or legislator or congressman. Sorry, tell me about that.
The National Journal, every Congress comes out and rates all 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, from the most conservative to the most liberal members of the Congress. And what it did is it rated me as one of only 7 congressmen who rested in what they called the center, that is in between the liberal most Republican and the conservative most Democrat. Unfortunately, the rest of Hawaii's delegation is on the far, far left of the spectrum, but I believe that that's not where public policy is made, and you are the most effective representative for your constituency is in the middle. And I was one of the 7 congressmen who was in that center. And amongst the 7, actually, of the 179 Republicans ranked from most conservative to most moderate, I was ranked 178th out of 179. What I think is not good for the future of our nation is that back in 1982, National Journal has been doing this ratings for over 20 years now. Back in 1982, something like 250 members of Congress rested in that middle. That is between the liberal most Republican and conservative most Democrat. 250. By the 111th Congress, there were only 7, and I was one of those rapidly dwindling middle 7. I want to reverse that because I think that's not healthy for our nation and our democracy going forward.
Okay, now I'm going to do a couple of hot button issues for you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, don't ask, don't tell. You voted to support that, and a lot of Republicans were upset about that.
Actually, voted to
undo it.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I should explain what that is. It's the you explain it, I guess.
Yeah.
About
well, don't ask, don't tell.
Right.
It was a Clinton administration policy. President Clinton adopted a policy that allowed gays to serve in the military, and so gays have been serving in the military for the last 20 years or so.
Right.
It was just a policy of don't ask, don't tell. Military officials were not allowed to ask people about whether or not they were homosexual, and if you were homosexual, you weren't supposed to say it. I believe it is a failed policy. It is a policy that has not worked. Again, you can be gay and serve in the military. That has been the case for the last 20 years. The United States military has some of the strictest anti-fraternization rules around. It is much stricter than any civilian employee. I believe those anti-fraternization rules are sufficient. And also, it's based on my own personal experience having served in the U.S. Army Reserve. And that is, as an Army Reserve officer, I saw too many instances in which I had soldiers serving in the Army Reserve or the National Guard, getting a gigantic enlistment bonus or getting a college credit bonus, and all of a sudden when the unit gets called up for Iraq or Afghanistan, just suddenly claiming I'm gay and getting out. And I didn't think that was fair. So as a consequence of that, because I didn't believe it was a policy that worked, I voted in favor of repeal. And I was one of 15 congressmen to vote in favor of repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Okay. Now, what about I've got to ask you about this. Just this past weekend, the Republicans had a convention on Kauai, and one of the policies that came up, one of the resolutions that came up was voting. They didn't support the Akaka bill. You've supported the Akaka bill in the past, and you're taking criticism from it from some conservatives.
Yes.
Tell me, do you still support the Akaka bill, or do you see something else that you would like, or what's your issue on that?
Well, Malia, let me begin by saying here, nobody should assume, and I've been very proud of the fact that I've been an independent representative, as a state representative, as a city councilman, as a congressman. My loyalty is to my constituents, not to my political party, and I'm very proud of that here. So I have never been a lockstep partisan, and I think the Akaka bill, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell are perfect illustrations of how, when, and where I am willing to break with my political party for what I believe is in the best interest of my constituents. Now, specifically on the Akaka bill, I support a version of the Akaka bill that originally went through, I think it was in 2006, that allows the formation of some sort of body with negotiation with Hawaii state government. There are some versions of the Akaka bill that say we're just going to create this Native Hawaiian entity with no prior negotiations, just the federal government by fiat imposes this upon the state of Hawaii. I don't support that version. I don't believe that's a good idea. But if and as long as the federal government is willing to recognize Native American Indians, I believe similar recognition should be accorded to Native Hawaiians. And I support some sort of a plan that creates a negotiated recognition of such an entity.
Now, the House, from what I understand, passed that 3 times.
Yes.
The Senate's never passed it.
That's
and
correct.
It's been, even with Senator Kaka there and Senator Inouye and all this power, they couldn't get it passed.
And if I could just
Sure.
interrupt just real quickly here and illustrate for you, unfortunately, what I believe is a failure of our current congressional representatives in Washington, D.C., and that is, you're exactly right, Malia. The Akaka bill has passed the House 3 previous times, both in previous Republican and Democrat majorities. Now, with the new Republican majority in the U.S. House, we hear nothing. It hasn't gone anywhere. Why? Because Hawaii's current congressional representatives have been utterly and completely unable to communicate with the new Republican majority in the U.S. House. And that's why it's now floundering in not just the Senate, but both the House and the U.S. Senate.
Okay, moving on to a new topic.
Yeah.
Rail. You didn't really support rail here when you were in the council, but then you had got it on the ballot about the steel on steel rail. Should we have one? It won by a very little percentage, and which didn't mandate that a steel on steel rail had to be built, from what I understand. But if we did build one, it had to be steel on steel, right?
Yes.
Okay, so now we were looking at what Senator Inouye is promising, $1.5 billion for our rail system, which is supposed to cost $5.3 billion if there's no cost overruns, which is not likely with our government. And I was just wondering, what is your position on that now? Because there's a movement, there's a lawsuit to stop the rail because they say the process wasn't fair, the EIS process wasn't fair, the environmental impact statement. So what is your position about that? We haven't seen the funding come through.
Yes. Malia, my position on rail has been and continues to be that I'm very concerned about the financial costs, the financial implications of rail. I think if money grew on trees, if we had an unlimited supply of financial resources, I do think we should try rail. I think rail could work here in Honolulu. My problem with rail isn't whether or not rail could theoretically work or not. My problem with rail is that this proposed system is the largest public works project ever proposed in the history of our state. But more importantly than that, this is per capita going to be the most expensive rail system in the history of the United States of America. This is an astronomically expensive project that I don't believe that our community has the financial resources to afford. That's why, as a member of the Honolulu City Council, I was very clear and very consistent in voting against this particular project. That continues to be my policy. Now, with that said, in 2008, the voters did approve it very narrowly, saying that they wanted this particular project. So while I disagree with the results of the 2008 ballot, I do respect elections. I believe in democracy here, and I might not, voters don't always see the way I see things. Certainly they didn't see the way I thought 2010 election should have gone in my race. Right. But I respect democracy and the power of democracy. And I think that our policymakers today, we have got to be very careful about trying to, if we're going to do this project, try to do it in the most fiscally responsible way possible. Now, Malia, you've already hit on, I think, the biggest question out there on rail right now. It's no longer, are we going to raise the general excise tax we have? It's no longer, what kind of technology are we going to do? We're going to do steel on steel. The remaining gigantic question out there on the rail system is whether or not the federal government is going to give and rain down on Honolulu $1.55 billion in money. And again, I go back to that I believe Honolulu is in an exceptionally precarious situation when we have our congressional delegation all 100% Democrat, and they've shown an utter inability to communicate and talk with the new Republican majority in the U.S. House. It puts Honolulu and Hawaii taxpayers in a very vulnerable position. And the ability to get that funding is, I think, very questionable, and we have got to take it seriously, because every dollar that Honolulu does not get of that $1.55 billion from the feds is another dollar that's going to have to come out of the pocketbooks of Hawaii residents. And keep in mind, let's not forget, when then Mayor Mufi Hanneman originally proposed the tax for this rail system, he wanted a full 1% increase in the general excise tax. The state legislature only gave him authority to raise it by 1/2%, and that's currently what we have here on the island of Oahu. We raised the general excise tax from 4.16 to 4.71%. But I tell every taxpayer here, hold on to your wallet and hold on to your pocketbook here, because this train is coming down the pike, and it's unfortunately, I think, going to be a gigantic vacuum cleaner right in your wallet and right in your pocketbook.
It probably is. It probably is. And if we don't get the 1.5 billion, then what?
Well, Honolulu's in a very, very bad situation.
Yeah.
And no two ways about it here.
I mean, I don't see how we have the money to do the rail.
And Malia, I think on the rail system also, I think what also voters and residents must understand.
Yeah.
Most every other city that has done a rail system starts at the center of the city and builds out. So if you run out of money, at least you have a system that's running in the center of your city. So at least someone was going to use that rail system. Honolulu, under the Hanneman administration, I believe, made a very poor decision in deciding to start construction in an empty dirt field in East Kapolei. If we run out of money and have to chop off 4, 5, 6 miles of the 20-mile system, what are we chopping off? We're going to chop off downtown Honolulu. We're going to chop off Waikiki, the most intense area where traffic is. And we'll wind up with a system that runs from, say, East Kapolei to Waipahu or Pearl City.
Right.
And I would question, is that really worth several $billions of our taxpayer resources?
Exactly. All right, now I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Okay. You had the election where you won the special election, which was between Ed Kay's, Colleen Hanabusa and you went to Congress, and you made a million gazillion mile trips back and forth, back and forth. You were in the news every day, in the national news. It seemed like everything was going well. But then you went up against the Democratic Party, the entire Democratic Party, and you lost that race to to Colleen Hanabusa, who was then Senate President. Okay, now, and you're talking about in terms of what they're doing in terms of their quiet. So I want to ask you if you'd be willing to give them a letter grade. What about Mazie Hirono? Would you be willing to do that? Or even if you don't feel good about a letter grade, give me just the analysis of Mazie Hirono.
Well, with Mazie, I enjoyed working with her. She's a pleasant woman, but by any stretch, she is not an outspoken or bold representative in the United States Congress. She is a loyal foot soldier for the very far left wing, the Progressive Caucus, in the U.S. House of Representatives. But by and large, she has been a very, very quiet congresswoman. She does not regularly talk to the news media, does not regularly get out and forcefully advocate on behalf of the interests of the people of Hawaii. And I think her style of politics is something that probably worked really, really well in perhaps the mid-20th century. But I don't think that's the style of politics that will work well for Hawaii going forward in the 21st century.
Okay, Colleen Hanabusa.
Let me begin by saying that I congratulate Colleen Hanabusa. Yeah. She beat me in this race. Of course, I'm very disappointed, but I understand that, again, that's democracy. That's the way democracy works. I wish her well. I hope she succeeds. I have been a little disappointed that she has been marching lockstep with the Democratic caucus. The Democrats attacked me very vociferously and very aggressively during the election, that despite the fact I was the most independent member of Hawaii's Congressional Delegation, despite the fact that I broke ranks from the Republican Party, probably actually more than any other Republican except for one, they said I was still too much lockstep with my party. Yet I think Colleen is doing nothing but marching lockstep with their party leadership. We don't need that. What we need is somebody who's going to be bold, independent, and represent Hawaii forcefully, not the National Democrats or the National Republicans.
Dana Kaka.
Senator Kaka, exceptionally gracious man.
Everybody says he's the nicest guy in the world, and he is. Yeah. But what about his job?
I think in terms of his performance, the one key issue for Senator Kaka over his 20-plus years, 30-plus years in Washington, D.C., has been the Akaka bill. Now, he's been pushing the Akaka bill for not 4 or 5 years, but for almost 2 decades now.
Right.
And it hasn't gotten through. And I think that deserves its judgment on its own, that when your own signature issue and you're unable to get it to the U.S. Congress, unfortunately, I think that's a searing indictment of your capabilities as a representative, even if I do think he's a remarkably kind and gentle man.
He is, and also I have to give him credit for what he's done for veterans.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, what about Senator Inouye?
Senator Inouye is still, he deserves a lot of respect. He earned that respect in the fields of Italy in World War II and earning the Medal of Honor. He is a respected member of the U.S. Congress. I respect him. And of course, as chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the U.S. Senate, he has done a lot of good for Hawaii. But Malia, again, I go back to it that I believe politics, nationally and locally, are changing. There once was a time 40, 50 years ago, where the name of the game was pork. How much pork can you bring to your district? That was the time when you had backroom deals, where appropriations was what mattered. Today in 2011, with the internet, with bloggers out there and people looking at the budget, it isn't always necessarily that the path to power and staying in power is how much pork you can bring home. But indeed, a lot of upcoming members of Congress have made their mark in how much they are able to cut from government spending and how effective are they about streamlining and making government more efficient and still protect their constituents. So while I think Senator Inouye has amassed a lot of very well-deserved respect, while I believe he still continues to be an effective United States Senator, over the long term, I question whether his style of politics is still going to be the same way in the 21st century, and whether or not, and even if it is, I think people in Hawaii have to ask, at age 86, will he still be there for Hawaii 2 or 3 decades from now? Can we continue to rely upon him? Or do you believe, as I believe, that we have got to change our politics and change our style of representation?
Okay, now what about Senator, we only have a little while,
Sure.
But Senator Akaka's retiring, or I should say stepping down, and he's not going to run again. Now we've already heard Ed Case is going to run for Senate on the Democrat side, and we already heard Mazie Hirono today is going to announce that she's going to run. So what, what about that? Are you going to jump in the Senate race? Do you know yet? Or are you going to run for Congress, for the House?
Lilia, currently I am not a candidate for any public office. I've been consistent in saying that here. When the time comes, I will continue to talk very closely with my family, my friends, and supporters about whether or not a race for office makes sense. I have not decided. First of all, I have not decided on whether or not I am going to run in 2012, and I'm very far away from deciding if I do run in 2012, what office I might run for. For me, what's going to make a difference is how effective I think I can be in that particular office and how much change I think I can effectuate, combined with how much my family can handle another political campaign. What I will tell you, what's not going to play a factor in my decision-making process is whether or not some incumbent is or is not going to retire. I know the Democrats like to play this game. It's almost a feudal system of one particular duke or chief leaves an office and the next lower serfer or knight tries to rise up in the feudal structure. That's not me. That's not how I play it. And I want to remind all of your viewers, when I first decided that I was going to run for the United States Congress, I announced that I was going to directly challenge Neil Abercrombie for what he was then looking at running for an 11th term in the U.S. Congress. So challenging an incumbent is not something that scares me and won't deter me from running for office. By the same token, just because an office is open doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to run for it.
Okay, just a yes or no, because we're almost out of time.
Sure.
If Governor Lingle runs for Senate, will that stop you from running for the Senate position?
I believe Linda Lingle was a good governor. She is a good friend. I believe she would make an outstanding United States senator.
So will you challenge her if she runs for Senate?
I look forward to supporting Governor Lingle.
Okay. So we'll see. All right, we're going to have you back on the show when you make your announcement.
Sounds good. Well, let's do this again. Okay.
Thanks,
thank
Charles.
you very much here. Best wishes and aloha.
All right, thanks for having us. Thanks for joining us today with Charles Djou, former congressman. We'll see what happens next with him. This has been News Behind the News. Aloha.